Okay, well, good morning. My name is Hector Menendez. I'm faculty with the Department of Animal Science located in Rapid City, South Dakota. And I will be presenting today. So just went ahead and introduced myself here, and I'll be presenting about systems strategies. However, if there are technical difficulties with the text-enabled audio reader or any questions throughout the presentation, I will refer you to the host, Connie Strunk, who will be able to help you out with that. And so with that, let me just share my PowerPoints and we'll get this thing started.
Hector, you're muted.
Evan, thank you. Okay, well, let me start over. So Evan, can you guys see the full screen of the PowerPoint?
Yes, we can.
Absolutely.
Come through all good on that front.
Great. Okay, so as I was saying before I realized I was muted, that we were kind of at this position where a lot of management decisions have been made, and we're waiting, more looking towards next spring, what's going to happen during the winter in terms of snow cover and those types of dynamics. And so we're going to take a little bit different look at drought and how we can position ourselves as producers for the next season. And so with that, just to give you a little bit of background, so my extension appointment is a livestock grazing specialist for the state. And as I said before, I'm located in Rapid City, South Dakota. And so with that, we're really going to take a systems view of looking at drought. And so let me just tell you a little bit about my story here. Let me get this thing to click. Okay. So in 2011, I was in Huntsville, Texas. That's where I did my master's work. And so what you're looking at is Gibbs Ranch. It's about 1,400 acres. And I was growing a cool season forage. Here you might have some perennial ryegrass, but this is Lolium multiflorum, and it's a annual ryegrass. It contributes about 14 million acres of volunteer forage for Texas ranchers. And so as it's growing this ryegrass, it happened to be that every other year it grows great and you don't need to water it. Well, it was the worst drought in 50 years in Texas. And so you can see here the soil is very dry. And there's some, I think it was winter grazer mix at the bottom of that slope position. You can see on that right-hand panel. And that forage actually produced because of the slope position. So we'll kind of dive into that a little bit. During this time, I also had to sell all of my cattle. I had a little herd going. And so I wanted to be a little bit more personal and just say, well, I know what it's like to experience drought and have to make those tough management calls, even though mine was on a much smaller scale. But nevertheless, drought impacts us all who are in production. And so during that time, we can see the x-axis being years, and then beef cows in the millions, that there's about a 27% decrease in beef cows for the inventory within Texas. And then it rebounded 5 years later. We can see the 30% increase from between those time intervals. And so today, we're going to talk about systems thinking and system dynamics. Going to give some brief and generic livestock, crop, and environmental management suggestions or considerations of how to view these problems during drought. Then we're going to end with, well, what are the next steps? Because a lot of this is going to be high level, but nevertheless, I feel and believe valuable. And so just to orient you, another part of this presentation, we have several research farms and locations where many of the extension agents are at. And so this consists of a lot of our drought task force members. And so I want to highlight this because one of the things we can do is get our information from these people. And so just want to point out, our business, family, and marketing. These are specific members that have been on the drought task force, and they're probably some of the best people that you can contact for these specific things like business planning or marketing or family situations. And they can get you in touch with the people that are able to help you. And so just want to, as we go through the presentation, I'll be highlighting the drought task force members just so it's recorded and people know who to reach out to best get the information from or to be connected with someone else. This includes water resource and climate. And so these are just two more. Laura Edwards, who has presented a lot and presenting next week with Jack Davis, and David, who is in Mitchell, I believe, and it can help out with water resource problems. And so now that we kind of have that overview of some of the Drought Task Force members, we're going to move right into system dynamics. And so I want to give a background, since this is going to be part of my extension program, or is part of my extension program. When I talk about systems, and that word is tossed around a lot, and it's rather, it can be used generically. I'm referring to system dynamics developed through the MIT Sloan School of Business. And I'd like to give you a brief history, because so that on a producer level, this isn't just from some person in a lab, like we see this gentleman in the middle here with some of the first computer technology at MIT. And so Jay Forrester is the founder of the field of system dynamics. And he grew up in a ranch in Nebraska. So that's him on a horse on the left, kind of a cool picture. He helped work with some of the first computer and radar systems. So this gentleman has a ranching background. He understands ecology, and he is highly skilled in computer and software development and mathematics. And so he helped develop one of the first radar systems, and he actually volunteered to go into the Pacific Theater in order to have the only one working radar and maintain it so that they could detect incoming planes. And so I think this is important because, again, it's not just a scientific, clinical kind of observation of problems, but someone with a ranching background. And so with this, what Jay Forrester has given us is a lens, a different lens to view complex problems. And so we're going to talk about this in terms of livestock, crop, and environmental management. And hopefully you'll leave this presentation with a different viewpoint on how to respond to droughts and other problems that might persist in your operation. So structure drives behavior. Complex problems are complex because they're interconnected with many different things. And so whether that is livestock systems, crop systems, or environmental systems, our actions to fertilize, our actions to cull, or actions to plant a different crop, they don't not only have immediate costs like fuel cost or seed cost or labor cost and time, but there is a delay for how are they going to grow, how are they going to interact with the soil, what's going to be consumed, how's forage quality going to change. And so we could very quickly dive into all the interconnections within these systems. And so change is hard within agriculture systems because of the structures, the deeply embedded structures that drive how we operate and how we do business on a farm and ranch level. And so with this, it poses a lot of resistance to change or barriers to change. And so just to give you a very high level example, here's and this is what we would call a feedback loop. So this is a balancing feedback loop. We won't get into that technical detail, but we have the intensity of forest fires. This has happened in South Dakota this year, the Schroeder fire in California. And a quick fix might be fire suppression. So we just put out little fires when they start, and we're suppressing those fires. But as we suppress those fires, there's a delay and a buildup of material that's flammable, the undergrowth of the forest. And so because we've taken that quick fix, we've actually built up a lot of dead material. And so now there's actually worse forest fires because we didn't use a systemic solution in the beginning. And so this is just one example of quick fixes and policy resistance that we're going to get into. Also, these systems are complex and resistant to change because there's non-linear relationships. And so what does that mean? Yeah, I mentioned the fertilizer example compared to throughout the growing season and future like forage quality and quantity. Well, you might have started at work and you're happy, but then you get a bunch of small sources of stress during the week, and your cup, emotional cup gets fuller and fuller and fuller. And then, someone does something as silly as driving the speed limit in front of you, and you blow up. And I think this has probably happened to all of us. And so the reaction is not proportional to the cause of someone just driving the speed limit, but because you've built up this tension over the week, there's a non-linear reaction and explosion, right? So we can look at this in terms of physical systems, prolonged drought. And so I know this is the position I was in 2011, saying, oh, I can hold out, I can hold out, I can hold out with my, again, small herd. And hay prices kept rising. And so then we often see this is this holding out delay, and then cattle prices go down, beef prices goes up. And so this is a common occurrence that it happens quite regularly. And so with this, during drought, we might have motivations for change. So here's a picture of Cottonwood, South Dakota, our field station, southwest of Phillip. And this was taken in, I think, late July. And that's the intensively grazed pastures. And so we might have our available forage this season. And we say, well, we'd really like to be, have more forage. And so this difference between forage availability and desired forage creates a creative tension of where we're at and where we'd like to be. And so in order to wrap our heads and better understand on a systems level how to achieve that, we're going to take a better look at the structure of our problems. And so this is called the iceberg model. And so what's happening right now in terms of drought or forest fires is that there's an event. So we see in the news, drought's happening. It's happening now. Hay prices are increasing and things of that nature in the news. And so a lot of people react to events. However, we could look at slaughter prices of steers over time, or we're going to take another picture of drought over time and climate. And so there's patterns. And so we could also look at patterns and forecast or look at what's happening over time. But really there's another layer to it, which is, and you can see this conceptual diagram of, we have nursing, weaning, pregnancy. So that's a feedback of maintaining our mature cow population. But then we have this loop that connects from weaning to either going to backgrounding or pasture or finishing on a diet. And so we really want to dive deeper onto what interconnected parts are actually comprising our cattle or cropping systems. And the highest leverage to change, to enact a change to be where we want to be, whether that's forage or crop production, is challenging our mental models, which are deeply embedded assumptions or beliefs of how we view our agronomic or livestock systems. And so you see here a gentleman looking, walking through the field, and this farmer has a perception of how his operation or her operation works. And so what are the sources of pressure for these forces, for this structure? So there are a lot of, we see the same thing, events down to mental models, so mimicking the iceberg diagram. And so events are driven by kind of an organizational or cultural or economic systems, but then we're also regulated, these external structures, by regulations of what pesticides we can use or what different practices on the landscape or our stocking rates for lease land. And so these regulate how we can function in terms of agriculture production. But then there's another layer, interpersonal structures. So roles and role flexibility with your family, the relational skills, problem solving, decision making. And so that's kind of the on-farm ranch dynamics that are going on that are driving how our systems behave. And then again, the last one is how we think, how you view yourself and your role, and then your beliefs and assumptions about how the system works in reality. And so a lot of people take this approach, which is we have our goals or situation, there's a problem, we could say the problem is drought. We're going to implement the solution, such as buying feed or hay to get us through the drought, and then there's a result. So that's a linear or event-oriented decision-making paradigm, which we can contrast with a feedback view, which is, here's my decision, here's a real world, I make this culling or management decision, and then I have an information feedback, such as how much money did I make from that? Am I, cutting even? What are my losses? And so another layer is actually we get this information feedback. It goes through our mental models of how we perceived why that happened. Was it market conditions? Was it marketing? Was it how far I had to travel? And so we interpret this information from our decisions, and that informs our next strategy or structure or decision rules to make our next decision. And so you might be thinking, oh, okay, well, this sounds great, but let's have an example. So I'm just gonna give you a minute, and it's not as fun because you can't respond here. I guess you could respond through the chat, but everybody has deeply embedded mental models. So look at this picture. I'm gonna just be quiet for about 10 seconds. Okay, so here's the question. Do you see a white triangle? If you see a white triangle, um, it's actually not there. Your mind is seeing the shapes of these kind of Pac-Man figures and the other triangles, and it's inferring that there should be a white triangle there for you. And so this is just an example, a physical example of how our brain interprets information and will project or fill in the gaps for us of how we perceive the world. So we all have deeply embedded mental models of how we believe agriculture production systems work. These are the hardest to change. And again, changing them produces the highest leverage to equal results in our system. Okay, so another layer of complexity is feedback and time delays. I briefly mentioned feedback, but here's a rancher in his office chair, and we can see he's pushing over this domino. And so, that might be a decision to call, that might be a decision to buy more feed. You can think of your own example, I'm sure. And so often our decisions, why we can't understand the consequences, good or bad, unintended consequences, is because they're delayed in time. And so sometimes these decisions can come back to reward us, or we say, well, why is this happening? And it's because we made a decision last season that's affecting us now. And so that's, again, another reason why systems are complex. And so what we're looking for with this systems approach is high leverage solutions. We want to understand the structure of our agronomic or livestock systems and the feedback mechanisms that are actually causing the results that we're getting within our systems. And by doing this, we can potentially identify high leverage solutions. And so what do I mean by high leverage? A little bit of change equals a big result. And a big result, not just for things like reproduction or feeding or performance or forage availability, but for the whole system. And so I'm sure many of you, if you're a producer or scientist, might have told you, you ask them about a problem. I have this insect, or I have my forage is not responding as well as I believe it should. And they say, well, it depends. And so that's because it does depend on all the multiple factors of climatic conditions, what you're doing, when you're doing it in the system. But it's often a very annoying response. I know I've given it before. And so this is a typical response for the reasons I've just mentioned, that it really does depend. It depends on your soil type, your climate type, fertilization rates, everything like that. And so a systems understanding, I want to be clear about this, is if you're experiencing a chronic or persistent problem, it's probably a complex problem if you can't understand why something keeps happening. And so we want to identify those problems and really improve the entire system, the whole rather than the parts, by taking a systems approach. This helps us to avoid reacting to events. Sometimes events are uncontrollable, but it really helps us to be proactive in terms of our management. And this is focused on long-term systemic solutions. So the fixes that are going to give us long-term success. And so with that, I want to note, and this is really important, you might walk away from this presentation saying, oh, I have a hammer. Let me see where the nails are because I have a systems approach now. And this isn't for everything. You can get with Matt Dearson if you need a partial budget, or Tong Wang. If you have a disease problem, you get with Connie Strunk, who's in the Sioux Falls regional office. And so this is more for a systems level or complexity, but there are some problems where these people that I'm mentioning are extension professionals. You can just get with them. They say, yes, this is the problem. Here's the answer. And so I wanted to make that distinction as we move along. So the question I have for you is, are you experiencing the same problems each time drought occurs? I'll just leave you to ponder that. So now we're going to jump into livestock and range. Here are drought task force members that can help you directly or can point you to the right person for your livestock and range problems. And these people we're all on the western side of the state, but there's many people on the eastern side of the state as well. And so with that, we'll just move into climate. Is it the enemy? And so you might be thinking, okay, it's an external factor. There's nothing we can do about it, which is true. None of our individual management operations can affect climate. We could argue collectively they might, but there are internal forces or feedback within our management operation of how we manage things such as grazing, which can allow our systems to respond differently to changes in climatic variation. And so just to give you some example of previous work done, so here's the Cottonwood field station. It's one of the oldest field stations in the United States. If you haven't been out here, I'd welcome you to come visit. And it's located near Phillips, South Dakota. And on this range station, this is work that I'll cover from Dr. Sandy Smart and Dr. Dunn and Roger Gates, who were all livestock professionals at one point or another. And here's precipitation from their article from 1909 to 2004. And so this is total annual precipitation. And we can see, I'll highlight the black, less than 12 inches. And we can see the times that this occurs over that about 100-year period, more or less. Now here is broken down into April, May, and June, which outlined also by Smart and Ehlert and Brennan in their recent extension article, is that these are key times for precipitation for our ranchers for grass production. And so we can see that there's a consistency, and I've outlined here from their article that, you know, a normal year or above normal, it occurs about 4% of the time between years over the last 95 years. And so, and again, mind you, that is 2004. What I'm trying to emphasize here is that we know drought occurs and we should be prepared for these drought situations in terms of our management. And so by looking and having a history of production, we can better understand how to manage going forward. And so this is a kind of a companion article, I'd call it, even though they're not directly linked, from Dr. Dunn's work. And so they postulated, well, do we view the cattle as the factory or the grassland as the factory in terms of our production? And the responses they noted in 2006 from declines in beef cattle production would say that it's more of we view our cattle as the factory. And let me put this in the proper terms. Maybe we can take a different look at our grassland production and how those respond to climate and drought. And so here's some more recent updates. And this is from Dr. Jamie Brennan here at the Rapid City Center. And so over time, we notice the same type of trends. I know this graph is visually a lot to absorb, but if we were to break this down section by section, we can see these recurring intervals of drought or low precipitation years and high temperature years occurring at regular intervals. And so with that, it brings a lot of performance gaps, and I'm sure a lot of you have experienced performance gaps. And so just to go over this quickly is forage availability in terms of how we can adjust our stocking rates. Also, the total digestible nutrients or net energy or crude protein that might be in deficit because of these conditions, and deficits in average daily gain. And so I really like this graph that Ken Olson put together, and he borrowed the graphs or adapted them from Maddox 1965. And, you know, we really have a lot of performance shortfalls. And also we don't want to be overfeeding, even though I don't think that's the case in terms of supplementation, even though we can supplement right now for during times of drought, as Dr. Rushi has gone over in a previous drought hour. Other delayed impacts, so cold stress and heat stress are other considerations for maybe declines in dry matter intake for our cattle, or going into the winter season. Forage quality is low, that's something else you may want to contact Dr. Rushi or Adele Hardy to say, well, hey, do I need to more closely monitor my net energy in my forage to be able to adjust for those things? It's if it is a lower quality. And so just some other things to consider. And I put delayed here because it's not an instantaneous response. It's a physiological response over a period of 2 to 3 weeks. And so it might not happen readily, and we can manage for that as we go into the fall and winter season. And so here's another example of the daily variation from something that I published last year. And this shows the daily water use varying across the cow-calf, stalker, backgrounding, and then feedlot phases. And so I just want to emphasize here that these variations come from the delayed impact of climate, heat stress, or cold stress on dry matter intake of animals. And so if we look at this individual animal variation that's simulated, we can be sure that it's going to happen this fall and winter. And so with those kind of basic examples, we're going to move into a more system example. So fixes that fail. What is this? This is kind of this quick fix where we might have a herd size growing. And as we have our herd size growing, we have management requirements. As these management requirements go up, it allows us to continue to grow our herd size. So we can see here on this table, or orange hue, it's years on the x-axis and then management time on the y-axis. So a quick fix might be, okay, our herd size is growing. Let's burn the midnight oil. But it keeps going up and up and up over the years. And as that happens, an unintended consequence might be management capabilities. And so it erodes our management capabilities because burning the midnight oil only works so many times. And so this is just one example of some systems level considerations where you can position yourself to say, well, what is my goal? What am I trying to grow? And how am I solving that need or that performance shortfall? And is that eroding anything over time? Is there anything else that I'm not considering that might come back later on and really hurt my operation? And again, this is a broad way to contextualize your problems, but I believe a valuable way, because we're considering, again, short-term fixes versus the unintended consequence of that short-term fix. Another way to look at this in a more kind of advanced is forage shortage during drought. So a quick fix might be, let's wait out the drought and purchase hay or feed. And that would solve our problem in available forage versus the forage we actually desire, we need. And so that's might be, not always, but might be a quick fix. And so then the long-term fix, for example, is investment in forage capacity. And so this takes time to either improve your pastures or rangeland, or acquire new leases. And there's a lot of logistics and things that go into that, which will eventually increase your total capacity for hay and feed availability, which will then close that gap. So again, on the top, we have the short-term fix, and the bottom, we have the long-term fix. Now, the hidden component to this is that if we purchase hay or feed and we're not in an economical position, financial position, we could erode our available capital by spending money on that hay and feed. And so that's why this loop is called limited resources. And so if we do that this fall, and that's the position we're putting ourselves in, we may erode our ability next year to be able to invest in the long-term fix, which is that a lease or improving that range or pasture land, depending on where you're at. And this graph on the right just displays, again, on the y or the x-axis, time in years. And so this average cost per head, and this is there's a return on investment delay for this systemic fix versus this short-term fix, which gets us what we want immediately, but it eventually drives down production. And so here's an example from Rhodes et al. 2014. This was, I believe, from South Texas, but it kind of outlines the same, stocking rate, pressure to remain profitable. And so here's our quick fix, and here's our long-term fix, and that there's a balancing loop that's activated that it's called brush encroachment. So a different species is coming up because we've overstocked that land or overutilized the forage. And so that's an unintended consequence within our system that's going to come back and hurt our long-term efforts to improve overall rangeland health. And I'll just, this is a lot, the spaghetti diagram, but these black boxes are management interventions. So he highlights things like wildlife income or flexible replacement heifer or stocker enterprise. And so developing these types of strategies around better managing the stocking rates will be helpful as a consideration. So now we're going to shift gears into crops. And again, we have the co-leader of the Drought Task Force, Connie Strunk, and her, our colleagues throughout the state. And so they've highlighted over the past season different trade-offs for things like cover crops, insects, weeds, and then disease. And so all of these, have had what's the response? It depends. And so I've heard from all of them, well, it depends. Let's see what's going to happen as drought progresses. And so I would just encourage you to reach out to them to see what's coming in the next season in terms of what you're planting. And by the way, I have to give photo credit to all their individual websites, but things like cover crops with Dwayne Beck, Paul Johnson here in terms of weeds, and what might be coming in the next seasons. And they've highlighted that in their articles for these delayed consequences of the current fall conditions and rolling into spring. And so again, just trying to broaden the view of what's coming in the next season and what can I anticipate and manage for in the future. And so to give you an example, we're at Dr. Brennan and I were at the Cottonwood field station yesterday, and here's a sort of failed or stunted crop, and we can see a lot of weed prevalence throughout this field. And so that's just one more thing, one unintended consequence of, and there's not you can control about this, but the management implications are, what am I going to do about it next spring? And so kind of rolling over to crop and environmental considerations now is this same picture of drought in 2011. And so while I was out there doing my master's research, I observed that, one, there's no water, and rodeo cattle actually ate my experimental plots at one point. But nevertheless, I tried putting water on to get my grass to grow, and I noticed that it would beat up and roll downhill. And so our soils become hydrophobic during drought conditions. And so even if it rains, the probability that runoff, for example, will increase is higher because our soils are not prepared to receive that precipitation event. And so within these environmental systems, we really want to set ourselves up next spring to receive that precipitation or irrigation, utilize those most limiting resources, water, nitrogen, phosphorus, and carbon within those systems. And so another layer to those hydrophobic soils are precipitation events, which the extremes towards the spring and the fall have been increasing over the years for the higher frequency of high intensity rainfalls, and as we can see here from 1990 to 2010. And this does things like increase our soil erosion, our surface water runoff, and our total suspended solids counts within our streams and rivers, all of which we want to be low or near zero. And so things that can happen going into the fall season with exposed fields without cover is loss of soil through rill and sheet erosion, and also increased surface water discharge and water runoff. So not only are we losing soil, but we're exporting our water that we need for the next season. And then lower quality water in our streams and rivers in terms of total suspended solids, which is an environmental factor, and there might be some regulatory implications there. And so what I did during my PhD work at South Dakota State University is assess the Big Sioux, the James River, the Bad, and the Belle Fourche for erosion, surface water runoff, and water quality levels in response to grassland conversion. And so this really depends on existing soil conditions, precipitation management, and cover. And we can see here, just want to briefly outline that in all cases, we calibrated the model for based on historical data. And so it fit from 1947 to 2012, that data. So we felt confident to forecast from 2012 to 2062, just to give you an idea of what you're looking at here. And in all cases, we can see with these scenarios, if we removed grassland to 0%, or in this case, we can just say cover, erosion increased across all years in each of those 4 major watersheds. Additionally, and this one's a little bit harder to see, but discharge increase across all years within these catchments under similar scenarios, and especially as higher intensity rainfall events increased. And the same thing happened with water quality, is that our total suspended solids, sediment entering our streams and rivers decreased. And so here's just another example of conventional versus conservation tillage. And so this would be just regular tillage and then no-till. And we can see here in terms of the y-axis, this is 5 metric tons to 30. And then the same scale here for conservation, that no tillage resulted in significantly less across all of these scenarios, whether it was grassland or our base case, in terms of reducing soil erosion within this watershed. And so the point I'm trying to drive here is that our soil is like it is a bank for water. It's about 27% soil holding capacity in terms of soil water, but the fall conditions will determine our infiltration rates, our water holding capacity, and our nutrient availability for the next spring. It'll also, not just the soil condition, but what's on the vegetative structure will determine the snowpack we can capture and affect our rainfall capture. And so you can anticipate different levels of water, and that's why Sarah Bowder has put together a series of videos containing the different cover crop strategies and management strategies for soil health that can really help improve our water bank over the long term. And so with that, we'll just again broaden out a little bit more. So here's where you might be at. We're kind of talking about erosion over the next 50 years and these things. And so a lot of us live in this next week, kind of paradigm here versus our children's lifetime, again, on this x-axis. And then on the y-axis, we have our family level to the world. And so in terms of environmental management, very few people think this far out to their children's lifetime and at a world level. And I'm really thankful to be in South Dakota, where there's people who strive for things like the Leopold Conservation Awards to do things like this, to preserve and conserve our landscapes. But either way, there are immediate needs we have to meet. And so going into this systems view, it really helps us expand maybe for our lifetime or our children's lifetime in a practical way that's a long-term solution. And so with that, kind of going to the next steps, you might be thinking, well, this is really high level and what can I really apply? And so what we'd like to do is partner with producers, and we are working with some producers now for things like no tillage and livestock integration. And we're back to this, well, it depends. And so we'd like to say, well, do you have a persistent problem? And how can we better prepare you for in terms of whole ranch management or drought planning or climate resilience, and really do a systems analysis for your operation? And then we can evaluate things like trade-offs based on your ranch or farm objectives. And this requires that we assess those time and resources that are required to make a systems level change. And then this will help hopefully to position your operation for things like knowing key trigger dates of when to make herd management decisions, the opportunity costs of opportunity A versus B that will allow you to be ready to accept that cost and make those hard choices, or at least know what it is going to cost you. And then hopefully with this, we can position South Dakota producers to have a market advantage, to not just respond to events, but be anticipating with a plan A, B, and C how to best respond in terms of livestock production, crop management, and preserving our environment. And so something I want to point out is as we do this analysis, and I've heard this from other people in other disciplines, is that there's a worse before better. So for example, no-till will take about 5 years before we see a response. And so whether it's agriculture or general management, most producers fail because the system for systemic solutions actually gets worse upon making that change. And then there's an eventual response that will bring up our production, denoted by this green line, that things are getting worse, but in the long run, we are more resilient, more productive, and able to handle our systems, versus this delay that if we give up before we actually see the ecological or environmental benefits for our production systems, then we continue down the same path of losing productivity over time. And so something that we want to offer and that we are offering is we're developing a suite of real-time climate ready tools. And so you might be wondering, well, what does this mean currently? And here are some more loops for you. We have a systems performance and management. And so this kind of tells you, okay, I might need to implement some management action. And again, we perceive this through our experiences. So how are we performing? What are we doing? And how do we interpret that information? However, there are a lot of sensors on the crop and livestock side that are going to provide or are providing real-time data to better inform producer management decisions. And we're coupling those things with models and decision support tools so that you don't have to go through a tremendous amount of data, but just get the high-level information that you need to better inform these decisions and make system-level long-term decisions. And so this fits into our ability that we're building decision support tools. This helps us account for the information feedback and the physical feedbacks for those production systems. And an example of the decision support tools is here's Ehlert and Brennan. They developed a SDSU grazing calculator. And so really the ask is that if you see yourself with the same problem every time a drought occurs, we can break this down in terms of the structure of your system, and also in terms of an extension level, provide specific tools that would help you during drought. And so we'd love and invite you to give feedback to our team to be able to better develop these to meet our producers' needs. And so with that, I'm going to stop the presentation and I'll take any questions you might have. And Evan, while we're waiting to see if there's any questions and if Connie has any other information. Yeah, okay, you launched the poll. Thank you.
I'll just keep this running for like a minute so that everyone has a chance to answer. All right, last chance to answer the poll. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, and we're closed.
Okay. While we were waiting to see if there's any other comments or questions, I do have a QR code to share for the CCA credits. So I will go ahead and launch that. This will be the only time that this QR code is shown. So if you need certified crop advisor credits, please pull out your mobile device and scan that QR code to receive them. And I'll leave it up for a brief amount of time here. All right, I am going to close my sharing of the screen. If you have any questions, comments, oh, we do have a question. So Hector, are there any tips on setting up climate smart pasture? Example, like drought tolerant grass species being developed?
Yeah, so great question. We are not developing anything for drought tolerant grass species in terms of a tool. However, we're starting at the basic level for a producer not having to interpret NOAA data through Excel, where you'd go and click your latitude and longitude and get typical or normal production in terms of forage production, and then the amount of normal precipitation relative to that forage production. And so just streamline the process. Again, instead of a producer having to wade through that information, they can have it in instantaneously through that app.
Thank you for the question and the answer. Any other questions, comments? Is there anything additional you'd like to share with the group here, Hector?
I think just look out for Laura Edwards and Jack Davis next week in their presentation about the climate update and the economic update for the next edition of Drought Hour. But no, thank you everyone for your time, and I appreciate being on here.
Thank you. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to Hector and he will be happy to answer them. But with that, would like to invite you to attend Drought Hour next week, where we'll be focusing on climate and some market outlooks. So thank you for your time.